is something that you spend time on. And specifically today, what I'd love to do is talk a little bit about how to align this product framework to actually your business. And before I do that, just to reintroduce myself, I am Emily. I'm currently the CEO and founder of a startup called Bento, and we actually build software to help product managers engage with and collaborate with stakeholders along an entire project lifecycle, especially gearing up towards launch. And throughout the rest of today, I'll touch a little bit on why I think some of those aspects are incredibly important. My social media across everything is Emily Dan, and if you want to try out Bento in our beta, you can go to trybento.co. So Neha introduced a little bit around my product background, and over the last many years, I've gotten a chance to work at some really incredible startups that actually are all very, very different. And I think it's getting to be in product across 3 very different types of businesses that really informs some of the things I wanted to share today. So I'll briefly kind of introduce each of these so you have a little bit of background. Teespring, for those of you who don't know, is a marketplace where creators, for example, people who stream on Twitch, can design and sell their merchandise, t-shirts, mugs, etc., to their audience. So classic sort of marketplace e-commerce. And then I got to spend time at Intercom, which, again, as many of you know, is a software product that allows businesses to serve their customers, whether it is inbound sales questions, customer support, or actually outbound marketing. You might know it from the widget that you see on many websites. And then most recently, I was the head of product at Spoke, which is an intelligent internal ticketing system that's sold to IT and sometimes HR teams that allows these teams to better support employees and their questions throughout their life cycle in a more intelligent way that incorporates AI and ML and uses interfaces like Slack. So a marketplace with e-commerce, very much self-serve, B2B SaaS, and then enterprise software. That's all really pretty different. And so I think it goes without saying, and I'm sure you all already know this, but frameworks are incredible ways and tools to simplify and communicate how we make decisions. But it only works to the extent it is applied appropriately to your business. And if you've ever sort of come across a blog post that talks about some prioritization framework or some development process where it seems to make sense, but like you really can't think of how it would apply to your business, it might be because it actually just doesn't. And I know from personal experience, a lot of the literature I've read speaks to A/B testing and experimentation. And the first time I started working in B2B SaaS or an enterprise, I very quickly realized those actually didn't apply. And so what I would love to do today is actually share with you a specific lens, and that is, how does value actually get delivered to your customers, to your business, across these 3 types of businesses. And so it's probably worth kind of introducing some of the characteristics of these. And just for the sake of brevity, I will make some pretty simplifying assumptions around what they look like. Okay, up first, B2C companies. Think of these, we sometimes call them consumer. They might be marketplaces, e-commerce, or even social, but they share some characteristics. One of which is that the user or the customer usually interacts directly and exclusively with the product. So the screenshot I have here is actually of a page on Teespring where you can go and you can browse through merchandise, you add it to your shopping cart, and then hopefully a week later, something beautiful shows up at your doorsteps. And if everything goes according to plan, you're actually not interacting with anyone who works at Teespring. You're interacting with the digital product and then at the end, the physical product. Another key characteristic is that we're talking about very high volumes. It's not like you have 1,000 customers, but more likely it's tens, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of users. And as a product, a lot of what teams end up thinking about is how do you personalize that experience? If you're serving 1 million people, they probably all have slightly different interests, budgets, and so how do you make that experience something that feels much more tailored? The next one is B2B SaaS, and specifically of the self-serve nature. And so the screenshot here is of Intercom. I think what's interesting here is that, one, now instead of selling directly to consumers, you're selling products to businesses. And pre-purchase, it actually looks a lot like consumer. Somebody comes to your site, they might find you through content, through a Google search, and they're really in the driver's seat trying to learn about what your product does and whether it's a good fit for them. And almost always there's a free trial component. You can just dive right in without talking to anyone. But post-purchase, it starts to look a little bit more like enterprise. This is where when people run into issues or aren't quite sure how to use a certain feature, how to get the product to work within their workflows, they're doing things like searching for your help center articles. They are reaching out directly to customer support, sometimes even hopping on the phone or on a call. And then the third type of business that we'll look at is, again, B2B software, but here more on the enterprise side. The screenshot here is from @Spoke. And so the human interaction here starts much earlier. Usually the call to action isn't to just dive right in, but actually some sort of a sales process where somebody at your company is talking to a prospective customer and really learning about their needs, their context, their workflow, because so much more of the product and how it's used can be tailored. And when we think about the actual users, there's oftentimes many different types. The person who gets on the initial demo might not be the person who actually ends up using the product. And in the case for Spoke, we're serving not only the IT teams, but also the employees that work at the company. And the product team then really has to understand the different personas and the different needs of these users. And then finally, I think this one can't be sort of overstated, the tool adoption is actually just one part of the change. Oftentimes there's a big process change that teams like customer success will help the customer roll out. For one, you have to tell people that you're now starting to use a new tool, and then also teach them how to actually integrate it. Okay, so with these three different types of businesses, what do we mean by value delivery? And I think very simply, the question is, how does the work that you do or that we do as product teams actually translate to value for the customer and then for the business? For most of us, we're not building software purely for the technology, but actually to impact business outcomes. And across these three different types of businesses, in the consumer world, when you launch a new product or a new feature, the impact is instant. We knew this because sometimes we would launch things and you would hear about it instantly over Twitter when people would either rave about it or complain about it. That makes it very easy for product teams to draw almost a straight line between the work that is done and the impact. On the self-serve side, it's also pretty direct. But because you're not interfacing with millions of people, which means that at any given moment someone is exploring the product, this means that there can actually sometimes be a lag. Just because you launch a thing doesn't mean that everyone knows about it, especially if it's hidden in some part of the product or deeper into a user flow. And there's actually quite a bit more of awareness building that has to happen. This might come in the form of, a product announcement emails, webinars that get hosted. So the product impact is direct, but time becomes more of a factor. And then finally, on the enterprise side, you can build a thing, but if the sales team isn't talking about it, or if the marketing landing page doesn't talk about it, then people might not know. And I think this was like the biggest sort of mind shift that I had to go through, which is just because you build and launch a thing doesn't actually mean that customers or potential customers know about it, let alone use it. And because in this case there tends to be way fewer numbers of customers, those relationships become very important or even precious. And there are a lot of people who want to get in on those relationships. So within a company, account managers or customer success managers might want to have a lot more control over the interaction. So now we're talking both indirect and sometimes can span a longer period of time. Okay, so three businesses, different types of value delivery. So what? I think that the point is that, as product leaders, our goal is to deliver great product experiences to our users. But when large parts of the user journey actually happen outside of the software product, we actually need to look at the people and the interfaces that comprise the overall journey when we think about prioritizing, designing, and actually launching. And so that's the structure that we'll take for the rest of this talk, which is thinking about how do you prioritize, how do you design and build, and how do you launch? How does that look different across each of these business types? And then for each of these sections, I'll do a deeper dive into one of those business types and explain a little bit more around how that manifests. My guess is that most of you work in one of these three business types, and so hopefully will be an illuminating way to look at how product is built or run in a different type of business. Okay, how to prioritize. In the consumer world, a lot of this is driven by metrics. If you have a core business metric or a KPI that you and your team are trying to change for the upcoming quarter, whether that is revenue or churn or net basket size, there's usually some part of the product funnel that you can map out. And if in this case, if you're trying to improve conversion rates from visitors who are landing on a page to actually checking out, you can map each of those steps and actually understand where the funnel drop-offs are. And then you can pick a part of the funnel and say, if I improve conversion here by 50%, how will that flow through to money at the end of the day? And then a whole team can be goaled against that metric and run a lot of different experiments to think about moving that metric. So a lot of prioritizing in the consumer world becomes, what are the critical business metrics to change, by how much, and where are the biggest opportunities to do so? On the self-serve side, again, at this point, there is potentially a bit of lag between product changes and actually it impacting the customer. And also, you tend to have customers that are a lot more vocal about what they feel like is missing from the product because they're using it for work. They're not just doing a one-time, let's say, shopping experience. And so, because you have still usually a large number of customers, you can go through things like Intercom or Zendesk support tickets and be able to quantify to some level what are the areas of the product, what are the wish list features that people really wish that they had, and then be able to sort of filter through and prioritize, again, based on this direct feedback. On the enterprise side, it's also customer feedback, but it's a little bit different because you usually aren't dealing with thousands and thousands of companies. It might be in the hundreds or the low thousands. And because oftentimes product teams aren't directly interfacing with these customers, you're getting a lot of indirect feedback, right? It's from the sales team coming to say, I was just on a demo and this customer wants X, Y, or Z feature. Or customer success or customer support saying, this part of our product is super broken and we have to fix it. And that can create a lot of confusion internally because whose voice do you listen to? Well, on that question of whose voice do you listen to, it's again going back to that value delivery and that user journey. If you're a customer coming to buy enterprise software, there are multiple touch points probably before you even start using that piece of software. There are demos and conversations had with the sales team. There's a whole period of objection handling where a customer is saying, but you don't have this, or how do you map this feature to some part of my current workflow? And eventually, if they move forward, they're working with the customer success team to actually kick off and think about how to, again, integrate your software into their workflow, and finally implementation where the software actually gets rolled out and there may be internal trainings. And all along the way, the product team is hearing all of this feedback and asks for what to build and what to prioritize. And if we were to just stick that onto one list, it would be almost impossible to figure out how to trade off an ask that happens 5 times in a demo versus an ask that happens 4 times in a kickoff. But one of the most interesting things that I've seen and learned is that the feedback that you get across this life cycle actually changes. The things that seem to be critical blockers during demos, by the time you get to implementation, might not have been that important after all. And that's because at the end of the day, it's not just about people using the product and having feedback. It's also how they understand the product. And sometimes the feature requests that are made are actually not gaps in the product, but potentially disconnects with how the product is communicated or marketed or positioned. And so in those cases, it's not actually necessarily helpful for the product team to rebuild something, but actually for maybe the product marketing team and the sales team and the product team together to figure out how to better tell the story. Similarly, even later into the funnel, there might be times when a specific ask can actually be resolved through a certain workaround. And so again, those are cases where, in spite of the fact that frequency might be high, it might not be the biggest impact to go and change that specific part of the product. Versus later on, there definitely are cases where workarounds are not enough and where it truly is about functional gaps. And even here, because just building and shipping a thing doesn't necessarily move the needle on retention or conversion or revenue, it becomes really important to work hand in hand with the CS teams, with the marketing teams and the sales teams to actually make sure that the whole value chain, from communicating to onboarding to actually using, can actually take advantage of the fact that you and your team just invested in building something entirely new. Okay, so that is, one way of how I would think about how to apply potentially different lenses to how to prioritize. Well, surely it must get simple enough, right? When you get into the design and building phase. I think even here, the different people around the room can look really, really different across these different businesses. So on the consumer side, designing and building is almost always very, very tied to this idea of experimentation because you can afford to. Because if you have millions of users a month or, tens of millions of impressions, it means that you can actually set up an experiment, run a scientifically rigorous experiment, and get results within a reasonable amount of time to determine what you should do. And so really kind of designing those right experiments, figuring out those right metrics, understanding how long it would take for good results to come back becomes a really, really core part of actually designing and building. In B2B self-serve, and especially at Intercom, we spent a lot of time on research. The research team was actually one of the first teams that was built out at Intercom, and I think that ethos really carries all the way through to how product is done. And with research comes with the idea of iteration. And so usually we're not rolling out things, to everyone at the same time, but most features go through some level of a beta, where using things like feature flags, you might be able to experiment running, turning on a feature for a specific set of customers and then going back to do cycles of research. And on the B2B side, again, it looks pretty different because when you're designing and building, there are a lot of expectations that are set with customers, specific delivery dates or commitments to having something by the end of the quarter. And so perhaps you're doing deeper research with way fewer teams because you have fewer customers. Betas very much end up being opt-in. Enterprise clients don't usually love it when something really dramatic in their tool just changes. There's certainly much more of an expectation of training and rolling out. And what that oftentimes means is that a whole team can be very geared towards shipping on time, and you're certainly not running A/B tests when you have so few customers, but also there aren't necessarily as many rapid iteration cycles. So diving again into now B2B self-serve, and a lot of this is, the process that we had when I was at Intercom that we also tweaked and expanded upon. Let's say that your engineering team is off building. Beta becomes a really important part where we would work closely with customer support to figure out who are the right customers to be part of this. How do we reach out, tag them, and manage opting them into the specific beta? And the whole point of a beta is to de-risk the launch. And so what would be the point of doing it if you're not then diving deeply into feedback and interviews? And you might wonder, well, why is it not enough to just look at the metrics? And again, I think that comes back down to sample size. If you only have 20 or even 50 people in the beta, it's very unlikely that the metrics are going to be sufficient in and of themselves. Something that the research team really, I think, pushed us on, which was great, is that if you're going to bother to do research and feedback and interviews, then the team has to build in time to iterate. And we got to, at the end of one project, this heuristic that basically said the amount of time you're going to spend doing interviews, call it 3 weeks, should be in 1-to-1 ratio with the amount of time that the team would actually spend incorporating those insights and actually changing designs and how it's implemented. Because if you're not going to bother doing that, then what was the whole point of doing something like a beta? And so then oftentimes you would go back into building and back into doing feedback and interviews before finally launching. And this iterative cycle is quite unique to, I think, B2B self-serve, whereas with the consumer world, you can launch a bunch of experiments in parallel. And with the enterprise world, barring something going really wrong, you usually launch and it's launched. Speaking of launches, launching in the consumer world is very interesting because you don't really control the responses that come back. And we've talked a lot about experimentation. So, certainly on one hand, it is really about making sure that whatever you're trying to measure is appropriately not just instrumented, but that the dashboards, et cetera, are all prepped ahead of something like a launch. But social media is actually really important as well. And at Teespring, we would, make sure that whoever was responding to Facebook comments or Twitter, that they weren't caught off guard or surprised if customers were unhappy about something that had changed. And that's, again, very, very different than, where I spent my headspace on the enterprise world. So, the front line, so to speak, here has to deal with a much, much wider range of just emotions of what can happen. In the B2B self-serve side, I think one similarity is customer support. And at Intercom, we definitely baked in time and process to make sure that things like saved replies were prepped and ready because, the customer support team is dealing with so many different changes to the product at once. They can't possibly hold in their heads every single thing that is either in beta or launching for, new customers versus current customers. And so the product team, worked really hard to help our teammates be set up to support any questions that came up. Save replies is one way. Another way, of course, is to actually help create the Help Center articles so that customers can self-serve. And on the B2B side, it is entirely different because, again, there can be such a lag and it's so indirect between product shipping something and it actually, customers actually being aware of it or adopting it. And so, again, going back to that value chain, it became really important to make sure that the sales team knew how to talk about the new features or product changes, really explain why they were important to customers in the early part of the journey. And for customer success teams, oftentimes they needed quite a bit of heads up to prep their customers with information, with training, and so just a lot more sort of pieces of the pie pieces of the funnel had to be prepped in advance. And so now diving into the consumer side of the world, because experimentation is so important, because the product changes can very directly impact business metrics, measurement becomes incredibly important. You get what you measure, and you measure what you instrument. And something that I saw time and again is that the product team would be in such a rush to launch something that we wouldn't bring in folks like the data team until way later. But data teams can actually be incredibly helpful partners in designing the experiment, and not to mention working with engineers as they're actually building and instrumenting. But the other reason data teams are so helpful early on is that rarely does one change not impact anything else. And the worst thing is to launch something, see one metric move in the direction that you're excited about, only to find out 2 weeks later that a bunch of other metrics you didn't intend to impact had gone sideways. And so collaborating with data teams early on means that, one, more people are looking at some of the unintended consequences, and you can actually build in guardrails to potentially pull back or iterate if any of those unintentionally impacted metrics are not moving the way you want them to. So metrics and counter metrics. And then finally, because of the volume of interactions that is happening, it's actually really, really important that dashboards, et cetera, are prepped in advance of a launch because changes can happen on the fly. Whereas again, in the enterprise world, there can be such a lag, and you can rely on tools like full story or even user research sessions to actually get an understanding of impact. In the consumer world, again, it's far more data-driven. So, some concluding thoughts, and then happy to take questions. The first is, whatever strategy or framework that you are thinking about, it really becomes important to think about it in the context of your business and what's unique about your business. And specifically, I would encourage product leaders to think about how that value is created and delivered. What are the interactions that a customer is actually having from beginning to end, not just in the software part? And therefore, it's very important to identify who should be involved and when. We don't do it alone, and I think we all know this, but I think very often it can be easy to fall into a trap where we don't do it alone means we do it with design and engineering. But again, throughout these various examples, whether it's research teams, data teams, success, sales, marketing, operations, finance, there are so many people whose lives are impacted by what our teams do, but actually who we need to partner with in order to move the types of business outcomes that we're excited by. And when we don't, all of this work that goes into building a great product might not actually result in the impact that we're excited about. And finally, while it can always feel like it is a rush to launch, bake in that time to socialize ideas and communicate the why. Increasingly, the engineering team hopefully can sort of manage their own sprint cycles and velocities. The product manager in so many ways is an ambassador on behalf of his or her entire team to interface with other product teams and all of these different cross-functional stakeholders to really rally everyone around what it is that you're trying to impact and work with a broader team. So if these are things that resonate with you, the company that I'm building now, Bento, can't help you with number one. That one is a lot more of sort of introspection, discussion internally around what works and what doesn't work in your business. But we are trying to solve problems related to number 2 and 3. As the product management function matures and we grow into these leadership roles within our companies, and so much of it is figuring out sort of how we fit in with everyone else. And Bento helps streamline that process in a more intelligent way and actually allow teams like sales and CS and other teams to follow along in the journey, contribute, and result in more on time and more impactful launches. So that's me. And yeah, happy to, Neha, turn it back over to you and move into Q&A.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Emily. That was great. And I love how you talked about frameworks and how they are different in each of these different business types. So really appreciate all your insights in this topic. So far, we have one question from Lucas. I'll encourage the audience to share questions. We'll open the floor up. Feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand and ask for the mic. We're happy to do that as well. The first question from Lucas is, in my company, they're at an enterprise SaaS, and they have a development area where they're trying to incorporate the first product owner to help the best products and bring the vision from the client and not depend on the vision of the founders. What skills and where do you recommend looking for this first person in this new area?
Got it. So if I understand the question, there's a desire to not just solely build the product based on what the founders are excited about, but also really build based on customer impact and feedback. And I guess the question is like, where do you go, or maybe what characteristics do you look for in hiring for that role?
Yep, that's right.
Cool. So, I mean, I think that's actually a lot of the product manager and product leaders roles, kind of no matter what company you're at. At a company, unless you are the founder, usually the founders do have a strong vision for where the product can go. And so I think, maybe not yet getting into like where would you recruit and hire that person, but I think the characteristics that we're looking for is somebody who can almost like differentiate between what is feedback that is aligned with a product vision, and what are really like the gaps, right? So usually when customers have feedback, it's because like their actual context, the integrations that they have, the tools that they use are just so different than what your product actually currently supports. And therefore bridging those gaps isn't changing the vision, it's changing the implementation. Alternatively, it might be that actually the vision of where your founders think that they can lead the product isn't going to result in a great business. And therefore, this product leader needs to help convince the founders that there is a great business to be built, maybe in a slightly adjacent space. And so again, the skills there, I think, are ones of both being able to understand the logic of the business impact. Maybe that's revenue, maybe that's growth numbers, but also like step back more and understand what is the strategic impact, right? Very few people get excited about being like an outsourced dev shop, and I think that's one of the fears of being an enterprise software. And so it might not be about saying, if we just build these features, we'll get X revenue, but being able to say, if we can help these customers change their workflows and have impact, this is actually what we're unlocking for them, and being able to tell that story effectively. So I would say, look for people who definitely have a heart for understanding customers. They're not interested in building product just sort of in the ether, but really want to see impactful change. But they can also tell the story of where this can go in the future.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question comes from Justin. Yeah, and the question is, did you have all these teams and processes in place at your companies? If not, how did you build them? Did you have to advocate for resourcing along the way? If so, how did you make the case?
Great question. I think as companies scale, like it never feels like you have quite all the right people or all of the processes ironed out. Certainly something that I saw at Intercom and at Spoke for sure. I mean, at Spoke when I joined, we were so early. We were just in the process of launching the product to the general public. And so, the idea of betas, the idea of prepping help center articles, all of this was built from the ground up. And some of it, were processes that we could design because we could sort of apply logic to knowing that it would be important. And sometimes we learned it after the fact. For example, you launch something and you realize like crickets, like nobody is interacting with that part of the product. Of course, your metrics aren't moving. And then you realize, oh, it's because nobody knew about it. And so perhaps we should send out, a product launch announcement, maybe using something like Intercom. And so before advocating for like resources in terms of headcount, oftentimes I think product managers, with the skills that we have and the interest that we have, we get to be that chameleon and play a lot of these roles. And so the product team, early on, helped prepare, if not write, a lot of the Help Center articles, did demos with the sales team so that they could think about how to incorporate a new feature into a demo flow, was on the front lines of customer support as questions came in, created our own dashboards. And part of in doing it yourself is figuring out like what is actually really impactful. And I think as the business can see the impact of these actions, that becomes a lot easier to then advocate for hiring someone full-time, let's say on the customer success team, or hiring someone full-time on the data team.
Okay, super. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, and folks, just a quick reminder, feel free to add your questions in the chat or raise your hand and we'll hand over the mic. I hope that answered your question, Justin. The next question is from Shantanu, and he asked, how might one think about metrics and countermetrics as businesses scale up?
Great question. I think as businesses grow, complexity always grows. And so, any single thing you move, there's just many more skeletons that could be impacted. And so I don't have a, clear-cut answer to this, except to say you probably don't have all the answers in your own head. And that's where, being able to bring in other people on the data team, maybe other product managers, both to brainstorm and to also get a sense of like, how have they seen different metrics move? That's where that becomes, really important. I think that for a lot of PMs, it can feel like going to each of these stakeholders is almost like an internal sales process. Like you have a very clear idea of the experiment you want to run or the feature you want to build, and all you really need is for each of these teams to just like say like, I buy in and I'm approving. But hopefully what we can, encourage ourselves and our teams to do is actually understand that these people bring just different perspectives to the table. I think the other benefit is even if upfront you can't anticipate what are all the counter metrics, at least now there is more upfront awareness to be monitoring those. So I think the first step to preventing impact is actually just to know whether those things have been impacted. I think the second is, again, working closely with the data team. You can actually sequence different experiments so that it's less likely that two experiments are running at the same time. That muddies the outcome, where then you can't disentangle what is causing something to move negatively.
Yep, absolutely. And super important to include these in your testing plan as you're setting out to experiment. It should not be an afterthought. It should be part of the A/B test planning process itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, super cool. No more questions on the chat, but okay, yeah, there's one more. Do you have more ideas about experiments that go beyond A/B tests or feature flags?
Whoever asked that, maybe it'd be helpful to hear a little bit more around the context of your product or your business. And
yeah, so Diego asked this question. Diego, feel free to unmute and provide a little bit more context.
Yeah, this is more a general question because we do a lot of, I work in a small company, so we do a lot of A/B tests around different buttons that you want to, in A/B tests, of course, goes around conversions and count of clicks, etc. But if you're gonna want to go a little bit more on different angles, I mean, I'm just curious to know, like, if there are other ideas of tests or experimentations that we have practiced in the past or that you're currently testing, just in order to know for me, like when I think about my toolkit of experimentations, I take those in considerations as well.
yeah, and Diego, what kind of a business are you in? Is it a B2C, B2B?
It's a B2C.
Got it. Cool.
Yeah.
So uh, again, there's way more literature out there about A/B testing than certainly what I know. But I think one of the challenges with experimentation is that oftentimes it can move you towards what we call like a local maxima, especially if we're testing copy changes or small button changes. And so I think part of that is actually just starting to zoom out. So whether that is changing an entire onboarding flow, the sequencing of steps. I think Airbnb has some great case studies around how they changed, their host sign-up flow and just simply changed when they asked for a phone number. At Intercom, the team that I was a part of, one of the other PMs led this big experiment around, again, our onboarding and sign-up flows, just really thinking about how much information you ask for and when. And so that's like zooming one step out where we're not just talking about one screen, but actually a flow. And so that's like a much bigger scale of an experiment where you won't be able to identify necessarily what specific component caused the change, but you can see whether the overall change was helpful. But again, I think so often because we touch certain parts of the software, it can feel like those are the only knobs to turn, so to speak. But in your business, there might be a marketing landing page, or there might be ads that are running. And it turns out that like those are much more top of funnel moments that the user is still experiencing. And it actually matters. And so to give you a story, early on at Spoke, there was a period of time where we had a couple of early customers come in and they unfortunately didn't decide to stay with the product. And so I managed to get them on the phone or on Zoom. And when I asked them sort of what was the gap between the product they thought they were signing up for and what they actually saw, what I heard over a couple of calls was that they had seen an Instagram ad that was pitching Spoke as a new internal wiki, which is part of the product, but in some ways is like a misrepresentation of what the product is actually doing because it's a ticketing system. And so what would have been interesting is if we had just tweaked the product, we wouldn't have realized that part of the challenge was that there were customers coming in with a very different expectation of what the product should actually do. And so the final way of zooming out is to not just think about changing the overall product flow, but actually interviewing customers to understand how did they first hear about your product, what were their expectations, and potentially changing things that aren't even in your product at all. Diego, I don't know if that's helpful or if that's relevant.
No, that was great. Thanks so much.
Of course.
Okay, super. We still have about 12 minutes. So if there are more questions or just open-ended discussion topics, I'd love for the audience to throw that in. And any other thoughts? The floor is open. Emily, actually, I had a question that I'd like to pose. So you talked about iterating based on feedback and based on, results in all these 3 different businesses. How do you determine the validity of that feedback? Where sometimes if it's the outliers or it's the middle majority, how do you, from a product perspective, ensure that you're actually incorporating the correct feedback? Or do you go in a loop of testing iteration after iteration?
Yeah, great question. So in a consumer sense, by and large, it's a little bit cleaner because again, you can almost tie these product changes directly to the outcome. And, we were just chatting right now with Diego about how it might not just be product changes, but the overall life cycle. And so that's one way of thinking about validity, which is, do we have the right sort of aperture of the lens, so to speak. But at Intercom and at Spoke on the B2B side, a lot of what rendered an experiment or a beta as really good or false negatives and false positives was actually who you brought in to the beta. So for example, if we were shipping a feature that was really targeting helping solo IT managers at Spoke be more successful, then launching it to teams that had maybe 10 different IT managers spread out in different offices would probably yield very different results. And the beauty of being on the B2B side is, by and large, somebody at your company has context on who this customer is. Whether that is an account rep, a customer success manager, or sometimes even being able to look through the history of chat sessions that this customer has had. And that's why we definitely, for these various betas, worked very closely with support and success to think about like, who should actually be part of this beta, whose experience are we actually trying to impact, because not everyone is the same, and being able to pick people also at the right stage of their journey with your product is very important. The best example of that is when you're doing pricing experiments. It's very, very hard to do pricing experiments with existing customers because in no context or world do they ever want to pay you more. And most pricing initiatives are done so that the business can earn more money. And so when you're doing pricing experiments, it becomes really important to talk to people who look like maybe your current customers, but really look like the types of customers that you're trying to attract, and yet have actually not purchased your product before, or maybe aren't even aware of your product. Because if you're running, again, an experiment, a survey, interviews with existing customers, you're going to get very, very, very different data than new ones. And so, that's another sort of example of why picking your cohort is almost the initial best thing that you can do to set your experiment up for success.
Yeah, thank you. That was super helpful. We're at the top of the hour with 8 minutes left. So if there are other folks that were, any questions or any topics that are coming to your mind, feel free to share. We'd also open the floor now to have folks share if they're an interesting project that they're working on, that if they're trying to hire someone, or if they're folks looking for a job, please feel free to speak up and share your thoughts in these remaining 8 minutes.
I actually had a question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi.
I had a question come through from Tomas, and he's asking, how do you decide on pricing models? What is the product manager's role in deciding a pricing strategy?
That's a great question, which probably warrants a multi-hour webinar on its own. I think that very, very much depends on the type of business that you are in. So someone once said that, pricing is the type of topic that only really the CEO can own because everyone has voice and skin in the game. Sometimes it's, marketing teams that own revenue. Sometimes, sales teams always have very, very strong perspectives on pricing. I think one of the things that product teams can contribute to the pricing conversation is really thinking about how different price points might, or pricing metrics, might incentivize or de-incentivize usage. And so at Intercom, when we were working on pricing, a lot of times we thought about whether the pricing metric should be the number of users you are tracking, which seems very, very tied to the value that Intercom is delivering, but is really hard to predict when you are a business, versus more classic models, especially in customer support software, where you price per seat or per agent. And so the product team can help enumerate hey, if we price per seat and now all of these other people don't have access to the product, what does that actually do in terms of Intercom's ability to create internal collaboration and visibility so that everyone can see the messages and the context and the data that the customer is experiencing, right? And I think everyone can feel very, very aligned that that is a great outcome. And it just opens up that level of conversation. Meanwhile, right, sales teams are able to bring to the table the fact that if you're pricing on a metric that nobody is familiar with, that it just introduces so much friction up front to talk about why pricing is a certain way. And there are all these weird sort of hacks and corners that come up where people try to, make prices a lot more stable for customers. So I think I used to think that product teams, especially if it was more of a self-serve or B2C type business, that product teams should really be the ones that own pricing. But I think because of the complexity of the equation, it ends up being more of being able to like help others understand sometimes the unforeseen impact of what these different metrics can be, and ultimately work with the teams that own those revenue metrics to figure out what the right models could be. But yeah, pricing is a super tricky one.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you, Emily. We have another one from Charisma. I hope I'm pronouncing all these names right. Can you please share some frameworks used to feature prioritize for B2B enterprise model type business? Given the lag and indirect feedback, how can you discern critical features versus nice to have?
It's, I think in some ways it's more of an art than a science, especially on the enterprise side. One of the things I would encourage the PMs on my team to do in the enterprise world is actually, I think a lot of the literature out there around how to prioritize is very, very quantitative, right? It's like you have your features and you have like 3 weighted columns, and you can put in your assumptions around what the impact or the cost will be, and it computes some number. I think that there's worlds where that is applicable, but I think some of my skepticism is that any sort of very, very data-driven approach is very easily manipulated, because all of the inputs are frankly subjective. They're assumptions and hypotheses. And for those of us who've played with those types of frameworks, you know how easy it is to just bump a couple of numbers in one direction or another so that the stack ranked weighted average comes out in the order that you're actually really excited about. And so I think especially on the enterprise side, the thing that I would encourage people to lean into is really speaking to like the logic and the storytelling of why something should happen. So, I think one common example is just, if we build this, what precedent does it set? So let's say that you are building software that now is going to, integrate with Jira. Well, if you're going to integrate with Jira, are you also going to integrate with Asana? And if you're going to integrate with Asana, are you also going to integrate with Trello or Clubhouse or any number of these task tracking tools? And so then the conversation becomes not about should we build a Jira integration and how long does it take to build a Jira integration, how many people want a Jira integration, which is important. But the sort of higher level conversation becomes like, do we as a product want to become a platform? And if we want to become a platform, how does integrating with task tracking tools impact the way people can use the product or think about the product? And I know it's maybe not super satisfying because it's not a clear answer of like what you do from a framework perspective. But I think so much of, I think what I'm trying to share here is I think a lot of our roles is to help the team sort of zoom out. And in this particular case, zoom out to thinking about the product strategy. And if people are excited about that product strategy, then it becomes a lot simpler to say, all right, we're going to become a platform. Task tracking tools are a very important set of integrations. And then within that, it's a lot easier to stack rank based on number of customers impacted and potentially like the engineering lift to both build and maintain something like this.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Okay, yeah, and we got a vote of thanks too. Okay, anyone else? Guys, once again, feel free to raise your hand and, we'll hand over the mic if you want to share about a project you're working on, or if you're hiring, or if you're looking for a job. This is a good opportunity. So I see Van has raised his hand. Van, please share.
Yes. So thank you so much for setting up this call. It's really helpful. I have a quick question for Emily. So I saw that you have been in different industries over the years. So you have been in consulting, in a beauty industry, in e-commerce, and then now you are a founder. So I was wondering, could you share with us like your thought process in switching industry and also roles over the years?
Sure. Yeah, I think for most of us who are now in product, our journeys are probably less linear than they are direct. Um, I think early on in my career, I was mostly just optimizing for opportunities for learning and for growth. And so, like Van says, I spent my first 3 years out of college working for a strategy consulting company called BCG. And more than anything, it was that I didn't have any one thing I wanted to go work on. And consulting lets you really kind of sample a lot of different types of business problems and industries, and work with really, really smart people. And I just got a chance to learn so much from the people that I worked with. And then over time, as I spent a little bit more time in the workforce, I got very, very interested in technology and building software. I think that, again, for a lot of people who come into product, it's because we have a desire to create. And maybe we don't have all the skills from design to engineering to selling, but we're excited to sort of bring a team along together to do that. And so that's actually how I found my way into product. It was that I loved actually doing everything from thinking about, the business impact to what the user experience would be, to actually wanting to work closely with the teams that we're actually going to be building and launching. And then in terms of, specifically Teespring to Intercom to Spoke, by no means was that, a career roadmap. I think a lot of it was opportunistic. But I do think that at every juncture, I continue to just think about, like, where can I grow and where can I learn the most? In terms of starting Bento, this is actually the second company I'm starting. It's just something that, again, really taps into that, like, creator mindset. And in starting a company, you're not just building a product, but building a business and hopefully a team and a culture. That's really exciting. Building Bento in particular is so satisfying because throughout all of these years in product, I always wondered why every other team had tools, and better tools, but product managers were still hopping in between the engineer's ticketing tool to whatever the latest design tools were, to documents, and just spending a lot of time in meetings. And we hold so much in our heads that we want to get out there so that other people also have context and can engage. And I just didn't see software out there that made that possible. And across 6 years, I've spent so much time updating Google tracking sheets with the latest link to a spec or some date, and it just felt very archaic. And so with Bento, what we're doing is we're actually building a software product that integrates with Slack, with Jira, with Asana, with Google Drive, with Dropbox Paper, to help PMs build a very dynamic landing experience, a hub for each of their projects, and then actually build out the workflows that we go through, whether that's sending weekly updates, kicking off different phases and milestones with our stakeholders, incorporating feedback. And so I think Bento has also just been a very personally satisfying experience because I get a chance to help solve some of the problems that we face on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your knowledge and experience and insights with our group. And folks, I know some of you have asked, we will be posting this recording on Products That Counts website within 48 hours. You'll also hear a lot more information. You'll get a lot more information as this talk will, through Emily's insights, would be converted into some blog articles. If you prefer reading an article versus watching a webinar video, you'll have that format as well. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. And please reach out if there's anything that we can help you all with.
Thanks for having me, Neha. It's good to meet you all.